There is a letter in the Jefferson papers that rarely appears in the public image of Thomas Jefferson. It was written in August of 1787. In Paris, by a man who would become the third president of the United States. He was not writing about politics. He was not writing about revolution. He was writing to his 17-year-old nephew about the Bible. And what he told that young man could plausibly have done serious damage to his political future if it had reached the wrong hands at the wrong moment. He said, read it like any other book. Fix reason firmly in her seat. Do not be afraid of where honest examination leads, even if it leads you to conclude that no God exists at all. The man who wrote that letter is carved into granite in Washington, D.C. His memorial sits on the edge of the tidal basin, facing the water, and millions of people visit it every year. His words about liberty and equality are etched into the walls. School children read them on field trips. Tour guides recite them in the open air. The letter to his nephew is not on any of those walls. 7 years after that letter was written, another man published a version of the same principle, not privately, not for a nephew tucked away in a family correspondence that might never see daylight. He published it for public circulation, put his name on the cover, and let it travel through the country in print. That man was Thomas Paine. He lost nearly everything he had built in public life. The country he had helped talk into existence turned its back on him. The politicians who had once quoted his words during the darkest winters of the Revolution stopped returning his letters. The newspapers of the era called him an enemy of God. In the press of the era, as his political opponents worked to make that label stick. He died in a rented room in Greenwich Village in 1809. By most accounts, only a handful of people came to say goodbye. Same principle. 2 completely different lives. 2 completely different endings. This video asks why. Not whether Jefferson was right or Paine was right. Not whether the Bible is true or false. This video asks one specific question that has a specific historical answer. What actually happens when 2 men reach a similar conclusion? In the same revolutionary generation, tied to the same country, and one of them decides to keep it in a private letter, while the other decides to print it and let it travel through the country in print. The answer has been sitting in the historical record for more than 200 years. The easiest version of this story puts Jefferson and Paine on the same team and leaves it there. 2 Enlightenment thinkers. 2 skeptics of organized religion. 2 men who believed reason mattered more than doctrine. Same era. Same side of history. That version is not wrong exactly. But it skips the part that makes this story worth telling. Jefferson and Paine were not the same person. And the differences between them are not minor biographical details. They are the engine of what happened to each of them. Start with where they genuinely overlapped, because the overlap was real and substantial. Both men believed that reason, not institutional authority, was the proper tool for examining any claim about God or Scripture. Both were deeply suspicious of organized clergy and the power that religious institutions had accumulated over centuries. Both believed that if God existed at all, that God was knowable through the natural world and through honest thinking, not through texts managed by organizations with significant interests in particular outcomes. Both believed that the history of institutional religion was, at least in part, a history of ordinary people being asked to hand over their moral judgment to structures that benefited from receiving it. You can find all 3 of those positions in the actual writings of both men. The overlap is well documented, even if historians may disagree about how far it should be taken. But here is where the story gets more complicated. Jefferson still called himself a Christian, not in the orthodox sense, not in the sense that would have satisfied most of the churches of his era, but in a private sense. he developed carefully over decades. What Jefferson wanted was not to demolish the Christian tradition from outside. He wanted to recover what he believed was its true moral core, the actual ethical teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, which he considered among the most remarkable moral achievements in all of human history. His problem was not with Jesus. His problem was with what he called the corruptions that had accumulated around those teachings over 17 centuries of institutional management. He wrote in a letter to Benjamin Rush in April of 1803 that he was a Christian only in the sense he believed Jesus himself would have wished, meaning someone who genuinely followed the moral principles Jesus taught, rather than someone who had simply accepted the theological claims that others had attached to his name afterward. Paine drew no such distinction. He was standing outside the tradition entirely, examining it from a distance, and saying plainly what that examination produced. He declared himself a deist. Openly and without qualification, he rejected revealed religion, not just in its abusive forms, but as a category. His argument in the Age of Reason was not that Christianity had gone wrong somewhere along the way and needed correction. His argument was that the entire framework of revealed religion was a claim that could not survive honest scrutiny. One man was working within a tradition, trying to restore something he believed had been distorted. The other was standing outside, describing what he saw from there. That difference matters more than the overlap. His most religiously unorthodox writings were often kept outside the simplified public image built around him in the centuries that followed his death. The letter to his nephew does not appear on the walls of his memorial. The letters to Benjamin Rush, where he described his actual thinking about Jesus and institutional religion, are not the Jefferson that most Americans encounter in school or in popular history. Think about what that means for a moment. If that is what happened to the moderate, the careful one, the man who kept his most honest thinking in private correspondence for his entire public career, it tells you something precise about what happened to Paine. The man who carried a more radical version of those premises into public print, with his name on the cover, and handed the result to strangers. To see how the mechanism worked, you need to look at what Jefferson actually wrote when he believed only one person in his family would ever read it, and compare it to what Paine wrote when he decided the whole world should have access to the same thinking. In August of 1787, Thomas Jefferson was living in Paris as the American minister to France. He was 44 years old. The Constitutional Convention was meeting in Philadelphia without him. The country he had helped create was still figuring out what it wanted to be. And Jefferson, from his residence on the Champs-Élysées, was writing a letter to a 17-year-old boy in Virginia about how to think about God. The boy was Peter Carr, the son of Jefferson's late brother-in-law Dabney Carr. A young man, Jefferson had taken a particular interest in educating. The letter is dated August 10, 1787. It exists today in the Jefferson Papers at the Library of Congress. It has been available to scholars and researchers for well over a century. It is not a secret document. It is simply a document that rarely appears in the version of Jefferson that most Americans encounter in school, in popular history, or on the walls of monuments. What Jefferson wrote that August was more direct than almost anything he ever allowed himself to say in public. He told Peter Carr to approach religious questions the same way he would approach any other question of fact or reason. He used the phrase, "fix reason firmly in her seat." Place rational examination at the center of your inquiry, and do not let reverence or fear or social pressure move it from that position. He told Carr to read the Bible as he would read Livy or Tacitus, the Roman historians, meaning as a human document produced in a particular historical moment by particular human beings, subject to the same standards of evidence and scrutiny as any other ancient text. Read that slowly. because it is worth sitting with. A 17-year-old boy in Virginia is being told by the future President of the United States to read the Bible like a Roman history book, not with reverence assumed in advance, not with conclusions already decided, with the same critical eye he would bring to any other document that traveled a long way to reach him. Then Jefferson went further. He told Carr not to be frightened by whatever conclusions honest examination might produce. If reason led Carr to conclude there was no God, that conclusion arrived at honestly was better than a belief maintained through fear or habit or the desire to fit in. He was not telling his nephew to become an atheist. He was telling him that the honest pursuit of the question mattered more than the comfort of arriving at a predetermined answer. The man whose memorial draws millions of visitors to the National Mall every year sat down in Paris in the summer of 1787 and told a teenager that following reason all the way to the conclusion that God does not exist was not only acceptable, but admirable. If that was genuinely where the evidence led, he did not publish that letter. He sent it to one person he trusted. In a private correspondence he had every reason to believe would stay private. Now consider what was happening in Jefferson's public life at exactly this moment. He was a diplomat representing the United States abroad. He was about to return home and enter the political life of a new nation, still deciding what kind of country it was going to be. In that context, the letter to Peter Carr was not simply a piece of personal correspondence. It was a document that, if widely circulated, could plausibly have done serious damage to his political future at a moment when he had not yet built the political capital to survive it. Jefferson understood this. Everything about his public conduct on religious matters shows that he understood it with great precision. His public statements on religion were careful. They acknowledged a general providence and a divine author of the universe without specifying what he actually believed about Jesus, or the Bible, or the authority of any institutional church. The private man and the public man were operating on entirely different terms, and Jefferson maintained that separation with remarkable consistency for his entire career. Now set that alongside what Thomas Paine was doing 7 years later. In 1793 and into 1794, Paine was in Paris during the Reign of Terror, writing what would become the Age of Reason. He was not writing in comfort. The revolutionary government he had supported was executing people he knew. His own arrest was a real and immediate possibility. He finished the first part and arranged for it to reach a printer before he was taken to Luxembourg prison. He completed the second part during and in the months following his imprisonment, before James Monroe, then serving as the American minister to France, worked to secure his release. What Paine wrote was, in its core starting point, recognizably related to what Jefferson had written to Peter Carr. Examine religious claims with reason. Do not accept the authority of a text simply because an institution declares that text sacred. Recognize that honest inquiry belongs to every person, not just to those authorized by a religious institution to conduct it. But Paine did not send it to one person. He published it for public circulation and put his name on the cover. He made a deliberate choice that Jefferson had spent his entire public life carefully avoiding. That single difference produced two completely different outcomes for two men who were at the level of core principle, working from recognizably overlapping starting points. The letter Jefferson wrote to his nephew sits in an archive. It has been studied by scholars and cited in academic papers, but it is absent from the walls of the memorial that bears his name, and absent from the way most Americans are taught to think about the man who wrote the Declaration of Independence. Paine's published book shaped his public image too, but what it produced was not a monument. What it produced was a label. The label read, "Godless Infidel." It arrived before most people ever opened the book. it was still traveling nearly a century later. When Theodore Roosevelt, writing in his 1888 biography of Gouverneur Morris, attached to Paine's name the phrase often cited as "filthy little atheist," that tells you everything about how far the label had traveled from the actual content of a book that opens with the words, "I believe in one God." And no more. That is the gap this video is tracing. Not the gap between what Jefferson believed and what Paine believed, which was smaller than most people assume. The gap between what each of them decided to do with what they believed, and what that decision cost each of them in the currency that matters most in public life, which is not money and not power. It is the willingness of other people to be seen standing near you. Jefferson managed that currency with extraordinary care for his entire career. Paine spent it in a single publication and never fully recovered. By 1802, Thomas Paine had been in Europe for more than a decade. He had gone to France in 1792 to participate in the French Revolution, had been elected to the National Convention, had been arrested during the Terror and come close to execution, and had spent years afterward in France, writing and waiting for a political climate in America that felt safe enough to return to. That climate changed when Jefferson won the presidency in 1800. Paine had supported Jefferson. Jefferson had long considered Paine a significant figure in the history of American independence, and in 1802, Jefferson facilitated Paine's return to the United States. Paine returned to the United States in October of 1802. He did not return as the author of Common Sense. He did not return as the man who had written, "These are the times that try men's souls," the opening of the American crisis that Washington had ordered read to his troops because he believed it was one of the few things capable of keeping them from giving up entirely. He returned as the author of The Age of Reason, and that label had crossed the Atlantic well ahead of him. The Federalist press responded immediately. Jefferson's political enemies understood exactly what to do with the story of a sitting president welcoming back the man who had publicly challenged the authority of the Bible. They connected Jefferson's name to Paine's name, and Paine's name to the Age of Reason, and the Age of Reason to everything they wanted voters to fear about Jefferson's presidency. Jefferson did not respond publicly. Not what he did. What he did not do, he did not write a public letter explaining why he had supported Paine's return. He did not defend Paine's right to publish his religious views. He did not say, in any public forum, that the man who, in the view of many historians, had done more than almost anyone except Washington to make American independence possible and deserved to come home to the country he had helped create. He absorbed the political pressure quietly. He maintained his distance from the specific content of The Age of Reason, and he waited for the story to move on to something else, which it eventually did, in private. Jefferson's view of Paine was considerably warmer than his public silence suggested. He wrote in letters to people he trusted that he considered Paine's contributions to the American founding to be irreplaceable. He believed the treatment Paine was receiving in the press was disproportionate and unfair. He wrote those things in private letters, not in public statements. 6 months after the controversy had largely settled, Jefferson wrote to Benjamin Rush. It became one of the most candid documents in his archive on the subject of his own religious views. He described the moral teachings of Jesus as the most sublime and benevolent code of morals which has ever been offered to man. He distinguished carefully between those teachings and what he called the corruptions of Christianity that had accumulated around them over 17 centuries. He described himself as a Christian only in the sense of following what he believed were the actual moral principles Jesus taught, explicitly separated from the supernatural claims the institutional church had attached to Jesus' name afterward. That position privately shared several of the same premises as what Paine had argued publicly in The Age of Reason. though not Paine's full conclusion. The language is more careful. The tone is more measured. But the underlying distinction between the ethical core of the tradition and the institutional structure built around it runs through both documents. Jefferson wrote his version to Benjamin Rush in a private letter. Paine had published a version of the same distinction and let anyone read it. One of those men was dining with the President of the United States. The other was discovering, on his return to the country he had helped create, that most of the people who had once celebrated him now preferred to keep their distance. Now here is what matters most about Jefferson's behavior during this period. It would be too simple to say he was afraid. Fear is a motive, and motives are difficult to establish from the outside. Even with extensive documentary evidence, what the record shows is something more structural than fear. It shows a man who had developed, over decades of public life, a very precise understanding of what certain associations cost in the political environment he was operating in, and who managed those associations with consistent and deliberate care. Jefferson had seen enough of what happened to Paine to understand the cost of the label. He had seen Common Sense, the document that had done more for American independence than almost anything Jefferson himself had written, become nearly impossible to separate from the Age of Reason in public memory, because the same name was on both of them, and the weight attached to one had migrated to the other. So Jefferson maintained a very specific kind of distance. Not the distance of hostility, not the distance of genuine disagreement, the distance of a man who had decided that the work he was trying to do required him to remain in a position to do it, and that certain public associations would remove him from that position faster than any political opponent could. That is not the same as cowardice. It may even be a reasonable strategic calculation, depending on what you think the goal was, but it produced a very specific outcome for Paine. When the man who privately shared several of the same premises chose not to say so publicly, the cost of defending Paine was effectively raised for everyone else who might have considered it. Every person who watched Jefferson absorb the attack in silence learned something about what defending Paine was worth in that environment. And every person who made the calculation that it was not worth the cost contributed, without coordination and without any single person directing the outcome, to what happened next to Thomas Paine's place in American memory. Jefferson survived 1802. He served 2 full terms as president. He retired to Monticello and continued his correspondence. In his late 70s, he sat down with the New Testament and edited it according to his own convictions, keeping what he believed and setting aside what he did not. That document eventually reached the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., where it remains today. He did that alone, in a room, with no audience. Paine had published his version of the same impulse and lost nearly everything he had built in public life. Jefferson kept his version private and became a monument. What made the difference was not simply what they thought. It was where they allowed the thought to go. There is a temptation, when you look at what happened to Thomas Paine, to reach for a story about powerful people making deliberate decisions to destroy him. It is a satisfying story. It has villains. It has victims. It explains a complicated outcome through the actions of identifiable individuals who chose to do harm. That story is not accurate. And the accurate story is considerably more unsettling, because it does not require anyone to have done anything wrong. Start with a specific image from Philadelphia in 1794. A printer receives the manuscript of The Age of Reason. He sets the type, runs the press, and sends the copies out into the world. He is doing what printers do. Nothing unusual. Nothing that requires explanation. The response does not come from any central authority. It comes from the neighborhoods and congregations and dinner tables of the people who encounter the book, or hear about the book. or simply hear about the people who read the book. A minister mentions it from the pulpit on a Sunday morning, and the congregation listens with a specific kind of attention that has nothing to do with theology. A merchant decides he would rather not be seen doing business with someone known to have recommended it. A family quietly removes a young man from their social circle after word gets around that he expressed sympathy with its arguments. A newspaper editor decides that running a piece sympathetic to Paine would cost more in cancelled subscriptions than it would gain in new readers. None of these people are coordinating with each other. None of them have received instructions from anyone. Each of them is simply doing the math that their particular social environment makes obvious. This association costs more than it is worth. That is all the mechanism needs. Multiply that calculation by thousands of people across dozens of communities over a period of years, and you have the outcome that turned Thomas Paine from the most celebrated pamphleteer in American history into a man whose name, nearly a century later. Theodore Roosevelt attached the phrase often cited as "filthy little atheist" to, in his 1888 biography of Gouverneur Morris, without any apparent concern that the characterization might be challenged. No conspiracy. No coordinating authority. Just thousands of individual calculations, each one locally rational, each one made without reference to the others, adding up to a collective outcome that no single person designed or directed. Now set Jefferson alongside that image. In the decades that followed, Jefferson chose a different path. Private correspondence, legal frameworks, a university he spent years envisioning before it became a reality. Eventually chartered in 1819 and opening its doors in 1825. Designed as a place of learning organized around secular inquiry rather than religious doctrine. A place where the curriculum would be built around what human reason could establish rather than what any particular theological tradition required. Jefferson was making a related argument to Paine's. He was pushing against the same tendency he saw in organized religion to accumulate power that properly belonged to individual conscience. But he was making it through structures rather than through publications. Structures do not come with a label. That is a coherent strategy. It may even be a more durable one. If your goal is long-term institutional change rather than immediate public argument, but here is what that strategy required. And here is who paid for it. It required Jefferson to stay inside the boundaries of what the social mechanism around him would tolerate publicly. It required him to keep his most honest thinking in private letters. It required him to absorb the attack on Paine in 1802 without responding. To maintain his own position, by declining to publicly defend the man whose position he privately found recognizable, the cost of that strategy was not paid primarily by Jefferson. Jefferson survived. Jefferson built his university and drafted his statutes and died at 83 years old on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. The cost was paid by Paine. And it was paid by every person who came after Paine and wanted to engage seriously with the questions he had raised, and found that the label had arrived before the argument, and that picking up the argument meant also picking up the social weight of everything the label had collected over the years. People who found Paine's reasoning compelling faced the same calculation that Jefferson had faced in 1802. Silence was cheaper. Distance was safer. The argument might be sound, but the association was expensive. The questions shifted. They moved away from the range of things that careful, respectable people were understood to engage with publicly. They waited in archives, in private letters, in books that were technically available but socially expensive to be seen reading. Jefferson appears to have understood this mechanism with unusual clarity. He had felt it operating on himself. In the careful choices he made throughout his public life about what to say publicly and what to keep in the correspondence he trusted would not reach the wrong readers. and he built his institutions in full awareness of it, designing structures that would change the environment in which future generations asked their questions, without requiring any single person to absorb the full weight of what the social mechanism of his era was prepared to deliver to anyone who stood too visibly in the open. The University of Virginia graduated its first students in 1825, the year before Jefferson died. Its curriculum did not center theology. Its founding documents established that no religious test would be required of faculty or students. Jefferson had made his argument in architecture and curriculum rather than in pamphlets. The argument in architecture did not come with a label. Paine's argument came with a label. The label read, "Godless infidel." It arrived faster than the argument, traveled further than the argument, and lasted longer than almost anything else attached to Paine's name. And the people who might have removed it, who privately knew it was inaccurate, who understood that the age of reason opens with a clear declaration of belief in God, chose, un by un, in their own private calculations, not to spend the social capital that removing it would have required. That is how the mechanism works. Recognizing how it works is the beginning of being able to ask a more honest question, which is not whether Paine was right or wrong, but whether the questions the mechanism kept quiet were worth more than the cost of keeping them that way. Thomas Jefferson edited the Bible according to his own convictions. He took printed copies of the New Testament in 4 languages, English and French and Latin and Greek, and went through them with a razor and a pair of scissors. He removed the miracles. He removed the resurrection. He removed the supernatural claims that his own examination of the evidence had led him to set aside. He kept the Sermon on the Mount. He kept the parables. He kept the ethical teaching he considered the genuine moral core of what Jesus had actually said. Buried under 17 centuries of institutional interpretation and doctrinal addition, he assembled what remained into a document that ended not with an empty tomb and a risen figure, but with a sealed stone and a group of people walking away into the dark. There laid they Jesus, and rolled a great stone to the door of the sepulchre, and departed. That is the last line of the document Jefferson made. He chose that ending deliberately. He had 4 languages to work with, 4 complete versions of the text, and he chose to stop there, not at the moment of transformation. At the moment of finality, he never published it. He left it in his study at Monticello, and it passed through his descendants until it reached the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., where it has been held since 1895. Researchers who have examined it say the cut marks are still visible in the paper. You can see, if you look at the right page, exactly where the razor went and exactly what Jefferson decided the text could no longer include. Now look at what America did with Thomas Jefferson. The Jefferson Memorial was built in Washington, D.C., and dedicated in 1943. On its walls are carved several of his most celebrated statements about liberty, equality, and the relationship between a government and the people it governs. The memorial is visited by millions of people every year. It stands on the tidal basin, and on clear days you can see it from across the water. The words on those walls are real, Jefferson, accurately quoted, appropriately attributed. Nobody falsified anything, but the Jefferson on the walls of that memorial is a particular Jefferson. It is the Jefferson of the Declaration of Independence and the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. It is not the Jefferson of the letter to Peter Carr, where he told his nephew that following reason to the conclusion that no God exists is better than believing from fear. It is not the Jefferson of the letter to Benjamin Rush, where he described the corruptions of Christianity with a directness he never allowed himself in public. It is not the Jefferson who sat alone in a room at Monticello with a razor and cut the resurrection out of the New Testament in 4 languages. That Jefferson is in the archive, available to anyone who goes looking, but not on the wall, in a sense. America edited Jefferson the same way Jefferson edited the Bible. It kept the passages that fit the story it wanted to tell about itself. And it set aside the passages that complicated that story. Not through any deliberate act of censorship, not through a committee meeting or a written directive, through the same mechanism that had operated on Paine before it operated on Jefferson, thousands of individual decisions, each one locally rational, accumulating over time into a collective portrait that serves particular purposes and quietly leaves other things out. The pattern looks less like suppression than selection. Now, look at what America did with Thomas Paine. Paine is remembered primarily as the author of Common Sense. The 47-page pamphlet published in January of 1776 argued, in plain language, designed to be understood by anyone who could read, that the American colonies should declare independence from Britain, and that the time for doing so was now. By some estimates, it reached hundreds of thousands of readers in a colonial population of roughly 2.5 million. It is one of the most consequential political documents in American history. Common Sense fits comfortably into the national story. It is about political independence and the absurdity of hereditary monarchy and the natural rights of citizens. It can be taught in schools and cited in textbooks and celebrated in museums without making anyone uncomfortable about what else its author believed. The Age of Reason does not fit as comfortably into the national story. It is about the Bible, and about organized religion, and about the difference between a God knowable through reason and nature and a God defined and managed by institutions with interests to protect. So it is rarely placed beside Common Sense as a central part of Paine's legacy. It is more often treated as a complicated late development that changed how people remembered everything that came before it. America edited Paine the same way it edited Jefferson. It kept the part that fit the story and set the other part aside. And here is the thing that ties all of this together. Jefferson edited the Bible by cutting out the parts he did not believe and keeping the parts he did. Then America edited Jefferson by keeping the parts that fit the national story and setting aside the parts that complicated it. Then America edited Paine by keeping Common Sense and setting aside the Age of Reason. The same action, performed at 3 different scales, by 3 different hands, producing 3 different edited versions of something that was originally more complicated, too more honest, and more difficult than the version that ended up on the wall or in the textbook. None of those editorial decisions required a committee meeting or a written directive. All of them ran on the same mechanism: individual choices, made by people with specific interests in specific outcomes, accumulating over time into a collective portrait that serves certain purposes and quietly excludes others. A similar mechanism of social cost appears to have operated across 2 centuries of American public life. And it produced a version of history in which the questions Jefferson kept in his private letters and Paine carried into public print are present in the archive, but absent from the wall. That same gap between private experience and public authorization is still recognizable today. Recent surveys from Pew Research record that roughly 1 in 5 American adults now describes themselves as spiritual, but not religious. That group is not a product of Paine's direct influence, but the question they are living inside. The question of whether the thing they find meaningful when they look honestly at the largest questions of their lives is the same thing that organized institutions are offering them, is recognizably related to the question Paine refused to stop asking, and that Jefferson refused to stop writing about in private. The question did not go away. It rarely does. You do not need to know anything about Thomas Jefferson or Thomas Paine to recognize the calculation this video has been describing. Most people have sat with something they knew, or believed, or strongly suspected to be true, and made a quiet decision about whether to say it out loud. Not a dramatic decision with obvious stakes, just the ordinary private moment that happens in the space between knowing something and deciding what to do with knowing it. The calculation has variable. What is the thing you know? Who is in the room? What does saying it cost in this particular context? With these particular people, at this particular moment? What does not saying it cost? And who pays that cost? And is it you, or is it someone else? Jefferson made that calculation for 50 years of public life, and arrived consistently at the same answer. The thing I know belongs in the letter. The letter goes to one person I trust. The public version of me stays inside the boundaries of what this environment will support. He built universities and wrote statutes and designed buildings from that position. The University of Virginia still graduates students every spring. The laws he wrote are still in force. None of that is a small thing. Paine made a different calculation in Paris. Under the shadow of prison and possible death, he decided the thing he knew belonged to everyone, not just to the people he personally trusted. He published it for public circulation and put his name on it. And let the consequences come. He paid for that calculation for the rest of his life. He was still paying for it in 1809. When he died in a rented room in New York, in a city that had once needed everything he had to offer. By most accounts, only a small number of people came. The man whose words had helped carry a revolution to its conclusion was given almost nothing at the end. Neither of those men is a simple lesson. Jefferson is not a cautionary tale about cowardice, because what he built matters, and the word cowardice does not capture what he was doing. Paine is not a simple hero of honesty, because the cost of his honesty was real and the outcome was genuinely painful. What they are, together, is a record of what two specific choices looked like, played out over two specific lives. In a moment when the mechanism of social cost was running at full capacity, and both men could feel it operating around them, history does not arrange its lessons for easy consumption. But sometimes it places two people close enough together, with enough of their thinking preserved in letters and published books and documents with cut marks still visible in the paper, that you can see both choices and both outcomes at the same time without having to imagine either of them. That is genuinely rare. The letters are in the Library of Congress. The Jefferson Bible is in the Smithsonian, with the cut marks still there in the paper, showing you exactly where a man who became a monument decided, in private, what the text had to leave out. What you do with that record is yours. The question of what you do when you know something, where you keep it and where you let it go, who you trust with it, and whether you put your name on it. That question has always belonged to the person asking it. It still does.